This episode of Off the Cuff is brought to you by Weaver Simmons, and we're very pleased to bring it to you. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Off the Cuff. I'm Darren Chohan, and this is episode something.
It's episode 6, Darren, and I'm Matt Butler.
Thanks. So today we're going to get into something that hits a little bit close to home.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, and what we've seen a lot in the news in Sudbury lately, and as most of you know, or some of you don't or don't care, we live in Sudbury, and we have unfortunately had one gun violence episode a month since December. So I think it's been, maybe we've had 5 violent crimes in Sudbury, and we've made the national news. And
gun violent crime, like just specifically
gun
with guns.
Violence, yeah. And we've it's sad to report on. And last time we left you guys saying that we're going to be your reporters on the law, and this was really eye opening.
Yeah, unfortunately in Sudbury we have seen an uptick in violent crime, and like you said, particularly with firearms. And I don't know if anybody has been following sort of the federal government legislation, but there has been propositions to touch on gun control. So we thought, given that what's happened in this city and what's going on in the federal government, that we'd talk about guns a little bit and the law surrounding gun control. And
so I just, in preparation for this episode, we looked at the different incidents that happened in Sudbury. In December we had a murder at the Travel Lodge. There was a double homicide. We had in February, there was a first-degree murder charge that was laid in Wemekong, which is a First Nation just outside Sudbury. There was a shooting there. In March, there was a man that was shot downtown Sudbury with violence there. We had in April, just recently, a 22-year-old man was killed in a Sudbury sports bar shooting. And yesterday,
just last night,
we're filming this. Today is May 5th. There was a shooting downtown Sudbury again last night. And so, these incidents of violence are disturbing to us. It's one of those things where you don't like to hear about that in your community. And so we thought this episode, and it was quite appropriate that we decided to do gun violence, and also not just gun violence, but also to give the viewers and you guys listeners information about what is the safe way to obtain a gun, to own a gun. What does that mean? How do you know if you're just a casual person who wants to go hunting, what do you have to do? And so we're going to get into that today. And so why don't we start, I think, with the licensing requirements. I think that would be more appropriate than talking about the negative sides of having guns, but how about the safe way to own guns?
Sure. Some of you may know this already, but in Canada, you can't just sort of walk into any sort of store that sells firearms and go, I want that one, and you're walking out with that. It's not how it works in Canada. We do have, fairly stringent gun control laws that you have to follow certain steps to be able to acquire a firearm legally. And the first step is you have to take a firearm safety course. Now, in preparation, we were looking up at different safety courses that are provided, and the one that seems to be most often readily available is the Canadian Firearms Safety Course. And you need to do that just to be able to properly fire a firearm without any sort of legal ramifications outside of the exceptions and outside of where you're shooting, but also to obtain your position acquisition license, which is your license to actually obtain, possess, and acquire firearms. Now, in Ontario, there's the Firearm Safety Education Services of Ontario, and they have instructors. And the instructors are designated by the Chief Firearms Officer of Ontario, and they teach and test the course. And some of you may have taken the course. I, in fact, have also taken the course. And it's meant to make you familiar with the safe use of firearms, proper stances, how to load, how to deal with the ammunition, and just basically it's the safety measures of dealing with firearms. There's a written test and also a practical test that you have to pass prior to obtaining this course certificate. Then if you want assuming you pass the course, you're having to then send an application for your possession acquisition license with the RCMP. So there are background checks in order to obtain what people call their PALs, the possession acquisitions license. And to do that, like I said, you send the application to the RCMP. It takes between 45 and 60 days. Oftentimes it's more than 60 days before you get your PAL in the mail. And after that, you can obtain or go purchase a firearm. Now, there are differences between firearms and between restricted and non-restricted firearms in Canada. Your non-restricted firearms are your typical hunting rifles, hunting shotguns. However, some of them are restricted as well. And I would implore anybody who is interested in either acquiring or taking up the course to do your research on the RCMP website about restricted and non-restricted firearms. For example, like I said, the non-restricted rifles and shotguns. But then when you go restricted firearms, handguns that are prohibited, that's one of the criteria. Now, you have to make sure whichever handgun you get, whether it's prohibited or not, that could be a restricted firearm. That have a barrel less than 470 millimeters in length. Now, if you don't know what that means, then you may not think much of when you're acquiring a firearm or you're shooting a firearm, what that means. So it's important that you look up these firearms and see what's restricted or non-restricted.
And so while you're talking about that, and I'm what you would call a firearm complete like newbie. I don't know anything much about firearms, and I've discharged, I think, maybe one in my entire life. But what is the difference, and I think you had touched on this, with somebody who can discharge a firearm versus somebody who can own one? Like, is there a difference there, like being an owner or just somebody who wants to go in a group of people who are hunting and discharge a firearm? Is there a
right? So
difference
essentially, without your PAL, you can't purchase or possess firearms. However, with the safety course, you can go hunting and shoot firearms with somebody who has their position acquisition license.
So we could go together. I would have had to take the firearm safety course.
True. Yes.
But you are the owner of the firearm.
Assuming someone has their PAL and they're owner of the firearm, yes.
I could shoot it.
Yes.
As long as I also then have the hunting license to go.
Yeah, you obviously need to have the hunting license. That means you have to purchase either your small game license, put on the back of your outdoor card, and the same thing with the fishing license. You're having to do those things first before the season starts.
Right, but I could do that, but not necessarily be the owner of the firearm.
You could not then bring that firearm to your home and store it at that point, because there are also storage requirements. You're having to put, you're having to lock the firearm, or you're having to put at the actual trigger lock, and making sure that those things are taken into account. And then also like restricted firearms, some of them are AR-15, certain handguns, automatic firearms, even semi-automatic firearms. And like the purposes for those restricted firearms are often target practice, target tournaments, or just collecting items. So those types of firearms, you'd actually have to take a restricted firearm course. So if you want to have a position acquisition license for restricted firearms, you have to do both courses, the non-restricted and the restricted firearms courses, and then make the application for your position acquisition license, your PAL. A lot of mumbo jumbo here, a lot of procedure. However, at least there are procedures in place, in my opinion, that at least have some sort of background check. And
is there then a registry? So when you purchase these firearms, are they then registered to you as the person, and that goes onto a national registry?
I'm not sure about a national registry. That's a great question, and I'm kind of disappointed I don't know that answer off the top of my head. But they are registered to you, like to your person.
At least somebody knows you own it.
Yes,
and they're serialized, I assume. And,
yes,
and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's good. I mean, at least we know that we've gotten to a point in Canada where it's not like you can just go into a store and buy a gun and walk out.
No, you can in Canada. Like you said, there are procedures in place that you have to follow.
And so in preparation for this episode, we also have a nice connection to the United States. And our neighbors down south have a very different view on gun control. And so I thought maybe it would be helpful, we could talk about the Second Amendment, which we hear a lot. And I'll read that for the listeners and the viewers, because a lot of people don't actually know what the Second Amendment is in the United States. And for those who don't even know what I'm talking about, the amendments in the United States are constitutional rights that are every American citizen has, just like our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's a constitutional right. And so the Second Amendment in the United States Constitution reads as follows: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so this amendment has been the subject of a number of cases and lots of litigation in the United States. But what it boils down to, and Matt and I were talking about this before we filmed today, they've really interpreted this amendment. They forgot about the militia part.
It's never mentioned in these debates.
And the debate revolves around, no pun intended, a person's right to bear arms. And it's a person's right to carry a weapon, concealed or not, and for the purposes of what most people in the United States would tell you is self-defense.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's the thing. When the common misconception also we've heard in Canada as well is that we have the right to bear. Well, no, in Canada there is no constitutional protection about firearms.
Right.
In the U.S., like a constitution, like also the Constitution's different, obviously, but also a constitution is also to ensure that the state does not infringe upon people's rights. So though you have a right, it means that you have a constitutional right that the state does not infringe upon said rights. However, as like you read the amendment, it is to form a militia, meaning a group of citizens to fight against the state's oversight.
Right.
Oftentimes gets missed in debate.
And so recently, in June of 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States was faced with a question from the state of New York. And so the state of New York had made it a crime to possess a firearm without a license, whether inside or outside of the home, and that if an individual who wants to carry a firearm outside of his home can get an unrestricted license to have and carry a concealed pistol or revolver if he can prove or she can prove that proper cause exists for doing so. And that proper cause would have to demonstrate a special need for self-protection distinguishable from that of the general community. And so New York enacted this law essentially saying you cannot carry or possess a firearm without having the appropriate license. And so the Supreme Court of the United States held, and this is as recent as June of 2022, that the New York's proper cause requirement, which was to demonstrate that there was a unique need for self-defense, violated the United States citizens' 14th Amendment by preventing law-abiding citizens with ordinary self-defense needs from exercising their Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms in public for self-defense. And so as of 2022, this is still the law in the United States of America where, you have a state of New York trying to pass a law that says you need to have a license and show a need why you need this firearm. And of course, we know that New York's a democratic state, and this law comes out of a democratic state, but the Constitution of the Supreme Court of the United States is mostly Republican, I think, from what I understand.
Like judges on the Supreme Court? Yeah, they're mostly Republican.
Mostly Republican. And so it's not a surprise that because the United States court is very political, that, this law gets thrown down and says, no, we are taking a very Republican stance on the law that you would have to demonstrate a proper cause for carrying this or concealing this handgun. So that's just a little difference between the United States and Canada. And Matt had already mentioned where in Canada, you don't have a right to carry a firearm. That's just not a right. You don't
have a constitutional protection to have that right. It is a privilege.
Yes.
Meaning you got to go through the process, and if you commit infringements upon that privilege, like crimes or offenses, they could be taken away. So let's take a break, and then we'll come back, and then we'll dive more into Canada's more recent approach to gun control.
Yes. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe.
Do what you got to do to keep us around. Okay? Now that we're back from break, I wanted to talk about a recent case in the Supreme Court of Canada. It's R versus Hills. In Canada, there are certain criminal code offenses that carry mandatory minimum sentences due to the fact that, well, in these situations, because a firearm was used. In 2014, there was an individual who consumed a large amount of, we'll say, alcohol and prescription drugs, and then just took a baseball bat, started driving around the town, started hitting cars with his baseball bat, and then also had a firearm, started just shooting at it, just shooting his gun out. He unfortunately hit a house, and it actually went through the house and into the drywall. The family was obviously shaken up. This individual, Mr. Hills, pled guilty to 4 offenses, which one of them was including discharging a firearm into or at a house. And that's contrary to section 244.2, sub 1A of the criminal code. And at the time, in 2014, there was a mandatory minimum of 4 years of a sentence. Mr. Hills challenged the constitutionality of this mandatory minimum and was successful at first instance, so at the trial level. So the judge sentenced him to 3.5 years. On appeal, that was overturned because the mandatory minimum said shall be 4 years, and there was no discretion for the trial judge. At the Supreme Court, however, it was struck down. It was unconstitutional, and the reason being was Section 12 of the Charter provides that no individual shall undergo cruel and unusual punishment. And essentially, in this situation, it was that the proportionality of the 4 years for the crime was unconscionable. You shouldn't. Essentially, the court said someone shouldn't serve 4 years for this type of offense. And what really tipped the scales in Mr. Hills' side was that the main argument was the hypothetical of someone using a paintball gun or a child using a paintball gun in front of their home and it going and hitting the home or going through the home. Because some paintball guns are actually considered firearms, and that by that hypothetical, someone would be required to serve 4 years in prison. So that actually has been deemed unconstitutional. This specific section, this specific sentence, all that to sort of lead us into the federal Bill C21 that deals with gun control and amendments to gun control.
Right, and so this Bill C21 came into play quite some time ago, and it's taken a long time to work its way through Parliament. And as a disclaimer, even today we're finding out that it's being changed, and the Liberals are working on it, and it's still developing. So as of today, what we know about Bill C21 is, number one, there's a national freeze on handguns. So there's a national freeze on the sale, purchase, or transfer of handguns within Canada, and that came into force October of 2022. So you can still continue to possess and use your registered handguns and sell or transfer to exempted individuals, but there's a national freeze on the sale, purchase, or transfer of new ones as of October 21st, 2022. The next thing that this legislation purports to do is create this red flag law and yellow flag law in the legislation, which essentially allows, so the red flag law would allow anyone to make an application to court for an emergency weapons prohibition order for up to 30 days to remove firearms from an individual who may pose a danger to themselves or others, and an individual who may be at risk of providing access to firearms to another person who is already subject to a weapons prohibition order. And so these red flag applications are essentially to save individuals who, I think in the most common context would support vulnerable and marginalized groups like women, Indigenous people, and racialized communities. In the domestic violence context, really. And I think what the government is trying to do here is to say, look, we need to have a mechanism for people who are in these situations where they know their partner has access to firearms and they're fearful for their safety, they can make this application for the firearms to be prohibited and removed,
Right.
at least temporarily,
Mm-hmm.
so that safety concern can be dealt with. So that's the red flag law, and so
Yep.
that would be an application, I believe, under the criminal code to a court to get that order. And then there's a yellow flag law, which would allow the chief firearms officer to suspend an individual's license for 30 days, where there's a reason to suspect that that person is no longer eligible to hold a firearms license. And it would allow any member of the public to contact the chief firearms officer with information about another license holder. And it would allow the CFO to use the 30-day suspension to investigate a revocation of that license. So it's expanding the powers of the chief firearms officers to say, we think you're a risk, we think you're a danger, we've got enough evidence gathered we've done an investigation to revoke that firearms license.
Right.
And so these are all the mechanisms in which they are trying to limit people who shouldn't necessarily have licenses and have possession of these guns to take them away from them.
Just to make something very clear, we're speaking about this bill in very general terms. Though we've reviewed and we've summarized the bill, we're not going to speak on its, the specific minutiae of the way it's going to work. We're here to simply inform. So these, red flag, yellow flag, there's more to it than that. And obviously, just wanted to flag that down. Flag it.
And on top of that, again, we're really just reporting on what the legislation is. Again, not our views, we're just here to give you guys the information. So, if you have any questions or concerns, you can contact a lawyer that practices in this area to get your answers, or you can visit your MP's office, who may have some information if you're confused as to what you need to do. But always talk to somebody in the legal profession if you are unsure of what we're saying. The other piece to this legislation was to increase maximum penalties from 10 to 14 years for imprisonment of firearms-related offenses, mostly including smuggling and trafficking, because
Right.
that's become a big problem. And you heard me earlier in the episode talk about a couple of the incidents in Sudbury. Well, one of the incidents in Sudbury, the gun was from somewhere. The serial number was scratched off. It was an illegal gun. I mean, the person didn't have the gun legally, and so the legislation is being used to combat this trafficking and smuggling of guns, because it is a black market at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And so the government has to crack down on it. They're trying their best to come up with ways to do that. They're going to, they want to authorize wiretaps for 2 firearms offenses. They want to share firearms registration data with law enforcement across the country. In the event that somebody is buying an illegal gun from Ontario and selling it to, and then selling it to somebody in BC. They're looking to make it an offense for businesses promoting violence in firearms marketing and sales. That's an important one. They don't want people promoting gun violence because of, obviously, you heard me talk about the issues in just our city, let alone the issues going around the country. So that is one piece of legislation. Another, I think one of the more hotly contested ones, and it's in the media a lot now, is talking about the prohibition of the replica guns, the air guns. And I think this is what you were alluding to here.
Yeah.
Is like these guns, these air guns that closely resemble a real firearm and discharge a projectile at a velocity between 366 and 500 feet per second. And this is considered an air gun, and they want to include a prohibition on the importation, exportation, transference, or sale of these air guns. And some of these high-powered paintball guns and replica guns could fall under this prohibition.
Right, because they can be tampered with as well. But also, just to piggyback on that a little bit, also 3D printers. Right, because some people have been able to print fairly high-powered firearms just with a 3D printer. So this attempts to sort of encapsulate those types of firearms as well.
Right. And I think there's what they're also trying to encapsulate here is that, you don't necessarily want people, we can't be walking down the street with a handgun in our pocket concealed.
Not in Canada.
Not in Canada. And so if you're walking down the street and you have a 3D printed handgun in your pocket, but it's not a real handgun, the threat is still there. It's still a threatening object. And I think what they're trying to get at here is that we don't want any of that in the public sphere.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of, I think what encapsulates Bill C21. There's, and for those who are pro gun control, or there are going to be those who are anti-gun control and see that this bill is overreaching. That's fine. We're not here to influence you in any one way or the other. We're just here to present to you what the government is presenting to do. There are lots of advocacy groups out there that are worried about the impact that this Bill C21 is going to have on specifically hunters.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's, I think part of the prohibition in Bill C21 is talking about banning these SKS rifles and make them restricted firearms. And from what my understanding is, and from what, doing the research and reading about this, some of the advocacy groups are against this bill because a lot of the Indigenous people of Canada and a lot of the hunters who live off of the land use these old SKS rifles to hunt.
Yeah, and that's going to have to be apparent in any sort of grandfathering or any sort of regulations. About some groups may have to seek an exemption. Some groups may be exempt completely. Some firearms may be exempt completely. There's a lot that's going to have to go into this. And then on top of the potential argument for the overreach is any individual can bring an application to restrict someone's use of their firearms or revoke their PAL. And we know in our context of family law, we'll bring it back to our practice a little bit, is that some individuals can be vindictive and bring in any sort of application to make the other party hurt. So the overreach can have a sort of snowball effect into an abusive process. Now, obviously, there are checks and balances if someone is going to, abuse the process of litigation or of regulatory affairs. But in any event, the risk is there.
But you're opening, and I think what you're getting at is you're opening up an avenue for somebody to get an advantage in litigation, in the family context especially, when there may not be that threat or risk of harm.
Or at least have to just respond to it, even if there's no basis for it.
So now there's going to be this red flag law in which one spouse or the other can bring an application against the other in this criminal. And now you're not even just talking family court. You're talking about, this is an application in the criminal context, talking about a chief firearms officer getting involved and talking about license revocation. You're talking about a prohibition on weapons for 30 days.
Yeah, and you're dealing with a whole bunch of acts. You're dealing with the Firearms Act. You're dealing with potentially the RCMP and their sort of investigative bodies, the criminal code. So
you're dealing with a whole bunch of stuff, and you're and on top of that, I think the really far right groups are going to say, to what end? Because how many resources, government tax dollars, are you dedicating to this influx of applications that you're going to get to sift through the real ones and the non-real ones, right?
Yeah, that's completely true. So it's going to be a hot topic issue, I think, for some time, because it needs to be done right. But the main focus should be about safety as well, which that's what the attempt is always. However, individual rights still has to be respected. Right. It's the balancing act that is law, that is constitutional law, that is federal legislation.
This is why we leave this up to the legislators,
elective officials.
Yeah, and that's why you vote. So make sure you vote, because when you vote, that's who passes these bills and writes this legislation, really, your elected representatives. So that is our best effort in summarizing the current state of gun control in at least Canada for the time being. You guys, if you're interested, continue to monitor Bill C21 as it gets passed through. I think it's up for royal. Some of the parts of Bill C21 are up for royal assent soon, which means in law land that the king now will pass the seal of approval.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I know that he's not the most favorite person in the Canadians' world. We don't really enjoy the king. We like the queen, but in any event, that we're going to get royal assent for our legislation at some point soon. The Governor General will pass it, so stay tuned for that. I think what we'll do now is we'll take a break, and we'll get back into it right after that.
Thanks for sticking around. It's been a pretty heavy episode talking about gun control, gun violence, new proposals for for amendments of the Criminal Code and the Firearms Act with regards to guns. So it can be fairly difficult to talk about. However, have there been measures or funding to tackle this, uptick of gun violence?
Yeah, and so our community specifically, we live in Sudbury. For those of you who know and don't know where we are, but we're a hub. We're the center of Northern Ontario, I would say.
You're right, for the most part, yeah.
We got the train station here. Lots of the trains come through. And so we're a big center for drugs, violence, gangs.
Human trafficking.
Yep. Trafficking of drugs, trafficking of firearms, so there's a lot of stuff actually scarily happening in our city now. And so the recent statistics, which are a bit grim, talk about a 26% increase in violent crime in our city over 1 year.
That's not great.
There was 12 homicides that took place last year, not including the ones we've already talked about. And so it's a scary time. I think the COVID pandemic had a lot to do with that. You see a lot of, and I think our homelessness rate has gone up too. And I think, that attributes to it. And so from policymakers' perspectives, from lawmakers' perspectives, political issues, politicians, they got to look at this, right? They have to figure out, our MPs and our MPPs really have to work together to figure out, when you have these central hubs, how do we make those communities safe? Well, one way to do that is to increase police presence, right?
Yep.
Generally, that's like the general response.
Sure.
And so the federal government and our MP worked together in getting Sudbury some funding. So just a background on the funding that's available. There's this Building Safer Communities Fund, the BSCF, which was launched in August of last year, which provided a $250 million budget to assist communities with their gang violence and drug problems and gun violence specifically. And so Sudbury was a recipient of $2 million in funding, and the police service actually used that $2 million in funding, and it's a part of our police budget, which they've increased and created a homicide unit and increased police presence throughout the city, and are really trying any methods to reduce the instances of violence, the gun violence, the drugs, and the trafficking in our community. So those are a few things that the city is doing. We know that the public is a bit panicked about this. As we just said yesterday, there was a shooting downtown. You and I were talking about we're downtown sometimes in the evening, and that could happen to anybody. It makes you think,
more
right?
apprehensive about.
And so,
going downtown.
Viewers, listeners that are from Sudbury, take care of yourselves when you're downtown. You know what's happening out there, but know that the federal government, the local law enforcement, people are working hard to try to figure out how we can minimize this. So, small silver lining in
our efforts, at least efforts to tackle this. Yeah,
in an otherwise, I guess, sort of grim and depressing outlook on things. But we sometimes have to talk about the hard things. That's why we're here and we're reporting on this stuff, because when we were preparing or deciding on the topic for today, I was just kind of looking at the news and saying, like, we got to talk about this because something's going on here, and people need to know about it. And so,
yeah, and it was quite on point that there was a shooting yesterday.
yeah,
And it just sort of solidified that this has to be a topic. This has to be not just a topic of discussion for us, but just, where you stand on guns and where we're at as a nation, as a province, as a community on that topic. So something to think about.
Awareness, I think, right? What we
yeah.
really wanted to do was bring awareness to the issue. We're not here to, bark our political views, or we're not here to, shove ideologies down your throat. It is fact. And when we're preparing for this is all we're presenting to you is fact. The stuff is happening. Things are being done. And that's where we're at.
I hear you.
So with that, I think we'll leave you with that. We'll put some links in the description to some of the stuff we've talked about today.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested in diving into this, Bill C21, you can look it up on just on the internet, do your research. And then regarding restricted and non-restricted firearms, you can actually go to the RCMP website, and they actually have a lot of good information. So feel free to just go ahead. I'm Matt Butler.
I'm Darren Chohan.
This was Off the Cuff,
where law meets life. See you next time.